My 6-year-old stepson said one sentence at the kitchen table that unraveled everything. I loved my wife completely until I started paying attention. What I found didn't just end my marriage. It ended hers too, and she never saw it coming. My name is Marshall Langley. I'm 43 years old, and I own 3 tire and auto service franchises in the greater Knoxville area, 2 in the city, 1 out near Farragut. Built them up over 12 years from one small shop I bought with a loan I had no business taking. I'm not rich by any stretch, but I'm stable. I pay my bills, I show up, I keep my word. My dad raised me to believe that's what a man is supposed to do. When Jolene and I got married 2.5 years ago, I knew she came with history. She had a son, Brody. He was 3.5 when we met, almost 4 when I started coming around regularly. His biological father, Gary Strickland, was barely in the picture. He paid his court-ordered support, but showed up maybe twice a year, if that. Jolene had primary custody, full control of the parenting schedule, and Gary seemed to have accepted that arrangement with something between defeat and relief. I stepped into that role without hesitation. Brody was a good kid, quiet, observant, the kind of boy who watches adults closely before he trusts them. It took about 3 months before he let me read him a bedtime story without stiffening up. By the time Jolene and I were engaged, he was calling me by my name, not Mom's friend. That was enough for me. What I didn't ask enough questions about was how her first marriage ended. I knew the broad strokes. She and Gary had grown apart. The relationship had run its course. It ended badly. I didn't push for details. I figured everyone had a chapter they didn't want to read aloud. I was generous with that understanding. Maybe too generous. The first year of our marriage was good. Not perfect. No marriage is, but good in the ways that matter. We had routines. Sunday mornings with Brody at the park down the road. Friday nights, cooking together, while some game played in the background. She was attentive, engaged, present. She laughed at my stories, even when she'd heard them before. The second year, things shifted. Subtle at first. She started going to the gym more regularly, which I didn't question. She'd always been active. She got a new phone and set a passcode on it, which she explained with a casual shrug about privacy. She started taking longer to respond to texts when she was supposedly running errands. Small things. The kind of things you file away but don't examine too closely because you don't want to be that husband. The paranoid one. The controlling one. I wasn't controlling. I was trusting. I now know there's a version of trust that isn't a virtue. It's a blind spot you've trained yourself to call something nicer. The moment I start this story from isn't dramatic. It doesn't involve a screaming fight or a confession or catching anyone in the act. It starts with Brody, 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table one Tuesday afternoon while Jolene was in the backyard on the phone. He was coloring, focused, not really talking to anyone. Then out of nowhere he said, without looking up from his page, "Kyle says my mom has really pretty eyes." I set my coffee mug down. "Kyle?" I asked, keeping my voice easy. Brody shrugged. "The man from the gym. He comes to the car sometimes when we pick up my school stuff." He said it the way kids say things, like it was nothing, like it was obvious, like everyone already knew. Then he went back to coloring. I stood there in my own kitchen and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not rage, not panic, something quieter and more durable than either of those things. I picked my mug back up. I didn't say another word about it, but I didn't forget it either. That night, lying in bed while Jolene slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and I made myself a promise. I wasn't going to react. I wasn't going to confront. I wasn't going to tip my hand until I understood exactly what I was dealing with. I'd built 3 businesses from scratch. I knew how to be patient. I knew how to plan. I started the next morning. I didn't sleep much that Tuesday night. I lay there running Brody's words through my head on a loop. Kyle says my mom has really pretty eyes. 6 years old. No filter. No agenda. Just a kid repeating something a grown man had said to his mother in front of him. The next morning I was at my Farragut shop by 7, handling a parts delivery and a scheduling issue with one of my technicians. I kept busy. Busy was good. Busy kept my hands occupied while my brain worked the problem the way it always worked problems, quietly, in the background, sorting through what I knew and what I still needed to find out. I texted Jolene around noon, thinking of hitting the gym this week. "Which one do you go to again?" Her reply came back in under 2 minutes. "The Fit Core on Middlebrook." "Why? You finally giving up the excuses?" Friendly. Relaxed. Not a flicker of hesitation in her tone. Maybe I wrote back. "Might check it out." She sent a thumbs up and nothing else. That afternoon, I drove past Fitcore on Middlebrook. I didn't stop. I just looked at the building, the parking lot, the layout. Then I kept driving and went back to work. 2 days later, Thursday, Jolene told me at breakfast she was heading to the gym after dropping Brody at school. Normal routine. She said she'd be back by 10:30, maybe 11. I called Owen Barrett at 8:15. Owen and I go back to 7th grade in Maryville. He's the kind of friend you don't need to explain things to. You give him the outline, and he fills in the rest. He works in commercial insurance now, which means he's spent 20 years learning to read situations for what they actually are rather than what they appear to be. I told him what Brody had said. I told him about the gym, the passcode on her phone, the longer gaps between texts. There was a pause on his end. Then Owen said, "What do you need?" "Just to know I'm not losing my mind." I told him. "You're not," he said. "What's your next move?" I told him I was going to the gym parking lot. I got a Fitcore at 9:40 and parked across the street at a strip mall, far enough back that I had a clear line of sight to the entrance without being obvious. Jolene's silver Accord was already in the lot, 3rd row from the door. I waited. At 10:15, a man walked out of the gym. Tall, mid-30s, the kind of build that comes from spending serious time in a weight room. He was carrying a gym bag and moving with the easy confidence of someone who was comfortable in his own skin. He stopped near the entrance, checked his phone, then leaned against the wall. 4 minutes later, Jolene came out. She spotted him immediately, the kind of immediately that means you were looking for someone, not running into them. She smiled, not the polite smile you give an acquaintance. Something warmer, something private. He said something and she laughed, tilting her head in a way I recognized. She did that when she was enjoying herself. Then she walked to her car. And here's the moment I keep coming back to, the one that cut through every excuse I've been making for her in my own head. She didn't drive away. She sat in the driver's seat, and through her windshield I could see the glow of her phone screen. Both hands on it, completely absorbed. That same soft expression on her face, the one that had nothing to do with grocery lists or school pickups or anything that belonged to the life we built together. She stayed in that car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on my dashboard. She had no idea I was sitting 100 yards away. When she finally backed out and drove toward the exit, I stayed where I was. I didn't follow her. I didn't need to. Not yet. I had enough to know that what I was dealing with was real, that Brody's offhand comment wasn't coincidence, and that the man from the gym had a name I was going to find out. That night, I started keeping voice memos on my phone. Not for anyone else, just for me. Dates, times, details. The same way I document an issue at one of my shops before deciding how to handle it. First memo, Thursday, 10:15 a.m. Tall male, Fitcore Middlebrook, mid-30s. She knew exactly where he was standing. I kept my voice flat and steady when I recorded it. Then I set the phone down, went into the living room, and read Brody his bedtime story like nothing in the world had changed. I've always believed that if you want to know the truth about something, you don't kick down doors. You pull one thread and let the whole thing unravel on its own. By Friday morning, I had a name. Kyle. I had a gym. I had a face. What I didn't have yet was a full picture. And in my line of work, you never make a decision based on an incomplete picture. You wait until the numbers tell the whole story. I ran the Fitcore website first. Staff page listed 6 trainers. One of them was Kyle Mercer, age 34, with a headshot that matched the man I'd seen outside the gym on Thursday. Certified personal trainer, 3 years on staff. I stared at that photo for a while. Average-looking guy. Nothing about him that explained anything. That almost made it worse. I searched his name more broadly. He had a social media presence, not locked down, which told me either he was careless or he didn't think he had anything to hide. Mostly gym content. Progress photos, client testimonials, motivational captions. But then, about 8 months back, a photo at some local 5K event. Kyle Mercer standing with a woman, his arm around her, both of them smiling. The caption tagged her, Dana Mercer. Married. I sat with that for a minute. Then I kept going. I pulled up our phone account. Jolene and I were on a share plan. I'd never had a reason to look at her call logs before. I had one now. I scrolled back 3 months and found what I was looking for without having to look hard. One number, appearing over and over. Mornings, midday, occasional evenings when I was still at the shop. Dozens of entries. I copied the number into a reverse search and got a name. Kyle Mercer, Knoxville. 93 days of contact. I closed the laptop, went to my Farragut shop, and spent 4 hours doing exactly what I was supposed to do, checking inventory, reviewing the week's service logs, talking through a staffing issue with my manager, Ray. Normal day. Completely normal from the outside. That evening, I started a new folder on my laptop. Password protected. I labeled it documentation and put everything in it. Screenshots of the call log, the trainer profile, the social media photo of Kyle and his wife. Every entry dated and time-stamped. Saturday afternoon, Jolene took Brody to his soccer practice, and I used the hour to sit with what I knew. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed 2 more things: physical evidence and the full story of how our first marriage actually ended. That second part was Owen's idea. I called him again Friday night, filled him in on Kyle Mercer and the call logs. Owen listened, then said something that stopped me cold. "Has she told you much about why things ended with Gary?" "Grew apart," I said. Her words. Owen was quiet for a second. "I did a commercial policy for a guy last year who knew Gary Strickland from a rec league. Said Gary got completely cleaned out in the divorce. Lost the house, paying support for her, not just the kid." I hadn't known about spousal support. Jolene had mentioned Gary's child support payments, but she'd never once mentioned receiving support herself. "That's worth a conversation," Owen said. I agreed. It took me 2 days to track down Gary Strickland through a mutual contact in Maryville. I sent him a text, kept it short and direct, told him I was Jolene's current husband and that I needed to talk. I expected silence or a refusal. Instead, he replied within the hour. "Yeah, I figured this day would come." When? We met Monday morning at a diner out on Asheville Highway, far enough from Jolene's usual routes that I wasn't concerned about being spotted. Gary was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth, coffee in front of him, looking like a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time. He was straightforward from the first sentence. No anger in his voice, which surprised me. Just a flat, tired honesty. "She's doing it again, isn't she?" he said. It wasn't really a question. I nodded. Gary wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Her guy back then was a trainer too. Different gym, same setup. I found out the same way you probably did. She got sloppy, and someone saw something." He paused. "I tried to prove it in court. Couldn't get enough together in time. She had a better lawyer, and she moved faster than I did. Took the house, got spousal support on top of the child support, and I've been paying both ever since." He looked up at me then. "Don't make my mistake. Whatever you've got, get more. Get it locked down tight before she knows you're coming." I drove back to my shop with Gary's words sitting in my chest like gravel. She had done this before. Same playbook, different husband. And the man across from me in that booth had spent years paying the price for not being prepared. I was going to be prepared. That night's voice memo was the longest one yet. After my conversation with Gary Strickland, I gave myself 2 days to think clearly before I took the next step. 2 days of running my shops, picking Brody up from school on Tuesday because Jolene had a hair appointment, reading bedtime stories, making coffee in the morning like everything was the same. It wasn't the same, but I needed her to believe it was. I called Owen on Wednesday evening from my truck in the parking lot of my beard and shop. I told him what Gary had said, the trainer, the playbook, the fact that Jolene had moved faster and smarter than Gary had been ready for. Owen said, "Then you move smarter." "I need physical evidence," I told him. "Something that holds up. Then you need to catch her in the act and document it properly." I've been thinking the same thing. The call logs were strong, but could be explained away. The gym sighting was suggestive, but not conclusive. I needed something that couldn't be spun. Thursday morning, Jolene mentioned she was going to the gym and then running errands. Estimated she'd be back around 1. I called my manager at the Farragut shop and told him I'd be in by 2. Then I drove to Fitcore and parked where I had before, across the street. Kyle Mercer left the gym at 10:40. He headed to his car, a dark blue pickup, and drove east on Middlebrook. I followed at a distance, enough traffic between us that it wasn't obvious. He took Kingston Pike east, then turned south on Rutledge Pike. I'd driven that stretch 100 times. Knew most of the businesses on it. When he pulled into the parking lot of a motel called the Ridgeway Inn, I felt my jaw tighten. I parked on the far side of a gas station next door with a clear sight line to the motel entrance. I went to the front office, came back out with a key card, and walked to a room on the ground floor. Room 114. Jolene's Accord pulled in 17 minutes later. She parked away from the entrance, closer to the street. Deliberately, I realized. Instinctively, I reached for my phone and started the camera. I photographed her car in the lot. I photographed her walking to room 114. I photographed the motel sign, the room number on the door, the timestamp visible in each shot. The door closed behind her at 11:08. I sat there and breathed. Slowly. Deliberately. I'd known this was coming, and it still landed like a fist. I waited. 1 hour and 19 minutes. Then the door opened. Kyle came out first, relaxed, no urgency. Jolene followed a minute later, putting on her sunglasses, running a hand through her hair. They stood outside the room for maybe 2 minutes, talking, a brief laugh, easy body language. Then they went to their separate vehicles and drove off in different directions. I photographed all of it. Back in my truck, I sat with the phone in my hand, looking at the images. Clear, time-stamped, unambiguous. The kind of evidence Gary Strickland had never managed to get. I called Raymond Holt from that parking lot. Raymond had handled a business contract dispute for me 3 years ago. Sharp, direct, no wasted words. Exactly the kind of attorney I needed right now. I need to talk to you about a divorce, I said when he picked up. And I need to talk about it today. Raymond fit me in at 4:30. I brought the phone, the call log screenshots, everything I had. He went through it without expression, asked 3 or 4 precise questions, then leaned back in his chair. Tennessee is an at-fault state, he said. What you have here is usable. The documentation is solid. He paused. Does she know you know? Not a thing, I told him. Raymond nodded. Keep it that way for now. Give me a week to prepare. I left his office feeling steadier than I had since Monday. Not good. There was nothing good about any of it. But steady. That night, I recorded the second voice memo. Dates, times, photo inventory, Raymond's name, and our conversation. Then I went home, sat across from Jolene at dinner, and let her tell me about her day. She said the gym was great, and the errands had taken forever. I said it sounded rough. I poured myself a glass of water and listened to her talk. Raymond Holt called me on Monday morning, 8 days after our first meeting. He said he had the framework ready and wanted to walk me through it before we filed anything. We set a meeting for Wednesday afternoon. That left me 2 days to tie up the one thread I'd been sitting on since my conversation with Gary Strickland. Gary had told me Jolene had a better lawyer and moved faster than he'd been ready for. What he hadn't told me, because I hadn't asked the right question, was exactly what moved faster looked like in practice. I texted him Sunday evening. One more question. Did she consult an attorney before you knew anything was wrong? His reply came back in 10 minutes. Found a charge on our joint card about 3 months before she filed. Didn't know what it was at the time. Put together later. A family law firm downtown. She'd been planning it while I thought we were just going through a rough patch. I stared at that message for a long time. Then I checked our joint credit card statement online. I scrolled back 4 months. Nothing from a law firm. I went back 5 months. There, a charge I'd noticed at the time, but assumed was something professional. A firm called Delaney & Cross. I looked them up. Family law practice, Knoxville. She had already seen an attorney. I forwarded the screenshot to Raymond without any comment. He called me back within 20 minutes. She's been preparing, he said, no surprise in his voice. That changes the timeline. We need to move by end of week. Wednesday's meeting with Raymond was efficient. He walked me through the asset picture. The house was mine before the marriage, which mattered. The shops were mine, established and documented before we wed. The prenuptial agreement we'd signed, which Jolene had treated like a formality, contained a fidelity clause that Raymond said was enforceable given what I had documented. She was counting on you not knowing about that clause, Raymond said, or not being able to prove anything. She miscalculated, I replied. Raymond allowed himself a brief, professional nod. Yes, she did. That evening Owen came by the house while Jolene was at her book club, or wherever she actually was. We sat on my back porch with the lights off, and I filled him in on everything. The prenup clause, Raymond's timeline, the charge from Delaney & Cross. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, she went to an attorney while you were still playing house husband. You know what that means. It means she was planning to be the one who filed first. I said, get out ahead of it, control the narrative, maximize what she walked away with. Same thing she did to Gary. Owen said, exactly the same thing. Different address, different man, identical strategy. And the only reason it wasn't going to work this time was because I'd listened to a 6-year-old boy say something at the kitchen table about a man named Kyle. I thought about Brody that night after Owen left. The kid was in his room, asleep, completely unaware that his world was about to shift again. He'd already lost one version of a stable home when Jolene and Gary divorced. Now he was going to lose another one. That wasn't on me. I knew that. But it sat heavily regardless. What I also knew, and what I held on to when the weight of it got too much, was this. If Jolene had gotten what she was planning, if I hadn't caught it, if I let the divorce happen on her terms, she would have walked away with spousal support, potentially a claim on the business income, and I'd have spent years in the same position Gary Strickland was in right now. Paying. Watching Brody on alternating weekends. Losing ground I'd spent 12 years building. That wasn't going to happen. Raymond filed the paperwork Friday morning. Jolene didn't know yet. She left that morning the same way she left every morning. Coffee, keys, a quick goodbye that had grown shorter and more automatic over the past year. I watched her pull out of the driveway from the kitchen window. I picked up my phone and recorded voice memo number 3. Brief, just the facts. Raymond filed. The prenup clause is in play. She visits Delaney and Cross. We've already countered it. I set the phone down and went to work. The papers were filed, but the silence in the house felt different now. Heavier, like the air before a storm that hasn't broken yet. Jolene didn't know. She went about her days with the same practiced ease that had once convinced me she was a woman at peace with her life. Now I understood it for what it was. The confidence of someone who believed she was still in control. She wasn't. Raymond advised me to maintain normal behavior until we were ready to serve the papers. Ideally in a way that limited her ability to act quickly on the financial side. I was already ahead of that. The shop accounts were in my name, as was the house. I'd moved the bulk of my personal savings into a separate account the same week I first called Raymond. Nothing reckless, nothing that could be characterized as asset concealment. Just a man being careful with what he'd built. Wednesday of that week, Brody came home from first grade with a drawing he'd made in art class. He walked up to me at the kitchen counter and held it out without ceremony. 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of what appeared to be a tire shop based on the circular shapes across the front. That's me and you at work, he said. I took it from him and looked at it for a moment. Crayon on construction paper, crooked lines, the kind of thing a 6-year-old produces with total seriousness. The tall figure had brown hair, which was an approximation of mine. You gave me the right number of fingers, I said. Brody looked pleased with himself. I counted. I hung it on the refrigerator with a magnet. Jolene came into the kitchen 10 minutes later, glanced at it, said cute, and started making dinner. I stood at the counter and thought about what Raymond had told me at our last meeting, that the prenuptial agreement covered spousal support, but not parenting arrangements involving Brody, since he wasn't my biological child. Legally, when this was over, I'd have no standing to request custody or visitation. Brody would stay with Jolene, and whatever contact we'd built over 2.5 years would exist only if she allowed it. That was a difficult thing to sit with. Owen had asked me, when I told him, whether I planned to stay in Brody's life somehow. I'd said I didn't know yet. The honest answer was that I wanted to, but I also understood that wanting something and having it be possible are 2 different things. Jolene was not going to make anything easy once the papers landed. What I kept coming back to, and what steadied me when the weight of it pressed down, was the larger calculation. If this marriage had continued the way Jolene intended it, if she'd filed first and moved on her terms, Brody would have watched me disappear from his life anyway, just more slowly, in the background, while a court decision stripped away what I'd built. At least this way, I was the one standing upright when it ended. And there was something else I hadn't let myself say out loud until that week. Sitting in my truck after closing up the Bearden shop on Thursday night. I was glad, genuinely, deeply glad, that Jolene and I had never had children together. We talked about it in the first year of our marriage. She brought it up a few times, not urgently, but consistently. Something had always made me pump the brakes. I told myself it was the business, the timing, not being ready. Now I understood it differently. The same thing that had made me careful with my shops, the instinct to protect what you've built, had been working quietly in the background of my personal life too. If we'd had a child together, I would have been Gary Strickland all over again. Paying support to a woman who'd planned my removal before I knew a plan existed. Missing my own kid on alternating weekends. Instead, I was 43 years old with my businesses intact, my house secure, and a prenuptial agreement with a fidelity clause that Jolene had signed without reading closely enough. Friday evening, I sat at the kitchen table while Jolene put Brody to bed. I could hear her reading to him, her voice traveling down the hall, easy and warm. She was a good mother in the visible ways. I didn't dispute that. She was also a woman who had run this same play on a previous husband and was halfway through running it on me. Both of those things were true at the same time. I'd spent weeks trying to reconcile them, and I'd stopped trying. Some things don't reconcile. You just accept the whole picture and decide what to do with it. Raymond called at 8:15. The process server was ready. Monday morning, at the house, before Jolene left for her day. "You sure?" he asked. "I've been sure for a while," I told him. "Let's finish it." The process server reached Jolene on Monday morning at 9:43. I know the exact time because Raymond texted me the confirmation while I was doing a parts walkthrough at my Bearden shop. I read the message, typed back a single word, "Received," and kept walking the floor. I'd been at work since 7. Routine helps. It gives your hand something to do while your brain processes things you can't rush. Jolene called 4 times before noon. I didn't pick up. She sent 3 texts. The first confused, the second angry, the third something closer to frightened. I read all 3 and responded to none of them. Raymond had advised me to route all communication through him for the time being, and I was following that advice to the letter. What I did do, Monday afternoon, was something I've been thinking about since the night I identified Kyle Mercer on the FitCore staff page. I confirmed he was married to a woman named Dana. I found her social media profile, mostly public, warm photos, the kind of account that belongs to someone who believes her life is stable. She deserved to know it wasn't. I drafted a message carefully. No emotion, no drama, just facts. Her husband's name, the gym, the motel on Rutledge Pike, the dates, the photographs. I told her I was the spouse on the other side of the situation and that I'd thought long and hard about whether to reach out. I told her I had documentation if she wanted it. I sent it from a secondary email address, included 2 of the timestamp photos, and waited. Dana Mercer replied within 4 hours. Her message was short. She was still processing. Clearly, the sentence is a little uneven, but she asked for the full documentation. I sent it. She replied again that evening. "Thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy. I'm sorry you're going through this too." We exchanged a few more brief messages over the following 2 days. She wasn't interested in coordinating anything dramatic. She just needed what I had, and I gave it to her without conditions. She was dealing with her own version of the same wreckage. I wasn't going to make it harder. What she told me, in one of those messages, was that Kyle had done something similar before they were married. A situation she'd known about, but chosen to overlook because she believed it was a one-time failure of judgment. She'd been carrying that compromise ever since, wondering. Now she had her answer. I thought about Gary Strickland when I read that. 2 people who'd given second chances to someone who used those chances to sharpen their approach for next time. Owen came by Tuesday evening. We sat on the back porch the same way we always did. No fanfare, just 2 men who'd been friends long enough to skip the performance of it. Dana Mercer reached out to me today. I told him. She's filing. Owen nodded. Kyle's having a rough week. He earned it, I said. We sat with that for a while. Then Owen asked how Jolene had reacted to the papers. I don't know yet, I told him. Raymond's handling the communication. I'll find out when I'm supposed to find out. Owen looked at me steadily. How are you holding up? I considered the question the way it deserved to be considered. Better than I expected, I said finally. I think I started grieving this a while ago, without knowing that's what I was doing. He nodded like that made sense to him, because it did. I recorded voice memo number 4 that night. The Dana Mercer exchange. Owen's visit. The papers served, the calls I hadn't answered, the texts I'd let sit. At the end I said, Kyle Mercer is about to have the same conversation with Dana that Jolene is going to have with me. 2 households. Same Tuesday. He thought this had no consequences. He was wrong. I stopped the recording and set the phone on the nightstand. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Raymond called Wednesday morning to tell me Jolene had retained Delaney and Cross, the same firm she'd already visited, as expected. Her attorney had contacted him, requesting a meeting to discuss settlement terms. Raymond had agreed to a preliminary conversation for the following week. She's going to push for spousal support, Raymond said. Her attorney will frame this as a long-term lifestyle adjustment claim. And the prenup? I asked. We lead with the fidelity clause, he said. The photographs, the call logs, the motel. She signed that agreement. Her attorney knows what it says. I told him I wanted to speak to Jolene directly before the attorneys started trading paperwork. Not to negotiate. I wasn't going to negotiate. But there were things I intended to say to her face, in our house, before lawyers turned this into a transaction. Raymond advised against it. I thanked him for the advice and scheduled it anyway. I called Jolene that evening, the first time I'd picked up or dialed since the papers were served. She answered on the second ring, her voice tightly controlled in the way people sound when they've been rehearsing. "We need to talk," I said. "Tomorrow evening. The house. 6 o'clock. A pause. "Fine," she said. She arrived at 6 exactly. I was already at the kitchen table. No coffee. No pretense of hospitality. Just the table between us and the folder Raymond had given me sitting to one side. Jolene sat across from me and opened with offense, which didn't surprise me. She said I was overreacting, that I'd made a decision without giving her a chance to explain, that a marriage wasn't something you threw away without a conversation. I let her finish. Then I opened the folder and laid 3 photographs on the table. The motel. Room 114. Her walking to the door at 11:08 a.m. She looked at them without speaking. "Kyle Mercer," I said. 34 years old. Fit core on Middlebrook. 93 days of phone contact before I took those photographs. Her jaw tightened. She looked up at me. "You follow me." "I did," I said. "After your 6-year-old son told me that Kyle said you had pretty eyes." That landed. I saw it in the way her expression shifted. Not guilt, exactly, but the recognition that the thread had started somewhere she hadn't controlled. She tried a different angle. Told me I didn't understand what had been missing in our marriage, that she hadn't intended for things to go this far, that if I just paid more attention she might not have. I stopped her there. "I talked to Gary," I said. Complete silence. "He told me about the trainer at the other gym." I continued, keeping my voice level. "He told me about the attorney you hired before he knew anything was wrong. He told me what it cost him." I paused. "I found the charge from Delaney and Cross on our account, Jolene. 5 months ago. You were in their office planning your exit while I was picking Brody up from school." She said nothing for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand that this isn't something I'm doing in anger," I said. "I want you to understand that I know exactly what happened and exactly how it was planned. And I want you to know that the prenuptial agreement you signed has a fidelity clause that Raymond Holt is prepared to argue in front of a judge with those photographs as exhibits." She looked at the photos on the table. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, running numbers, assessing positions, the same way she'd done with Gary, except this time the math wasn't working in her favor. "What about Brody?" she said. "Brody is your son," I answered. "I would have liked to stay in his life. You made that complicated." She left 40 minutes later without having agreed to anything, which was fine. That conversation wasn't about agreement. It was about making sure she understood the ground she was standing on before the attorneys took over. I recorded voice memo number 5 after she pulled out of the driveway. Short, factual, no editorializing. At the end I said, "She knows now. The performance is over. Whatever comes next happens in daylight." Raymond called me on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the papers were served, and told me Delaney and Cross had submitted their formal position. Spousal support, a claim on projected business income based on contributions during the marriage, and a request for extended transition time before Jolene was required to vacate the house. I sat in my truck in the parking lot of my Farragut shop and listened to him read through the list without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Walk me through what we counter with." Raymond was methodical, which is exactly what I'd hired him to be. The prenuptial agreement's fidelity clause was the centerpiece, signed, witnessed, filed with the county clerk. Jolene's attorney knew it existed and had already attempted to argue it was signed under duress, which Raymond described as a reach and a half. The photographs from the Ridgeway were time-stamped and clear. The call log covering 93 days of contact with Kyle Mercer was documented, and Gary Strickland had agreed, in a signed declaration, to provide testimony regarding the pattern of behavior he'd witnessed during his own marriage to Jolene. That last piece was the one that changed the room. Her attorney went quiet for about 4 seconds when I mentioned Strickland's declaration. Raymond told me, 4 seconds is a long time in a negotiation. I let myself feel a measure of satisfaction at that. Gary hadn't hesitated when I called to ask. He'd said, Without drama. Tell me where to sign. The man had been paying for a situation he couldn't prove for years. This was his chance to put something on a record. The system, as I'd come to understand it through Raymond's explanations, was not built with men like me in mind. At-fault divorce in Tennessee is navigable, but it requires preparation, documentation, and the willingness to stay cold when everything in you wants to react. Most men don't manage all three. They react too early, document too little, or trust the wrong people with information that gets used against them. I'd done none of those things, and it was making a difference. 2 days after Raymond's call, Kyle Mercer called me. I almost didn't pick up. I didn't recognize the number until the second ring. Then I did recognize it from Jolene's call logs, and I answered. His voice was calm but tight, the kind of calm that's manufactured. He said he thought we should talk, man to man. He said the situation had gotten complicated and that he hadn't intended for anyone to get hurt. He said, and this was the part that almost made me lose my composure, that I needed to understand that Jolene had come to him, not the other way around. I let him finish. Then I said, Kyle, I need you to understand something. This phone call is being recorded. You call me. Everything you just said is on tape, including the admission that you were involved with my wife. I'll be forwarding this to my attorney by end of day. Silence. Have a good afternoon, I said, and ended the call. I pulled the phone away from my face and looked at the screen for a moment. My hands were steady. My pulse was elevated but controlled. I'd been calm through the whole call because I'd known, at some level, that he'd make contact once things started moving legally. People who believe they're untouchable always want to manage the situation when they realize they're not. I sent the recording to Raymond within the hour. His reply was a single line. This is useful. Well done. Owen came by that Friday evening. We sat on the back porch with the lights on this time. No reason to sit in the dark anymore. I told him about Kyle's call. Owen shook his head slowly and made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He called you, Owen said, to explain himself. He thought he could smooth it over, I said. Some people genuinely believe that talking is the same as fixing. Owen looked out the yard. What's Raymond saying about the timeline? Mediation first. Her attorney knows the prenup is solid and the photographs aren't going anywhere. Raymond thinks we settle without going to trial. I paused. She won't get spousal support. The business income claim gets dismissed. She takes her personal belongings and what she came in with. Gary's going to feel that, Owen said. Gary's already on record, I replied. That's the closest thing to justice he's going to get, and he knows it. We sat quietly for a while. The neighborhood was settling into an ordinary Friday evening. A dog barking a few yards over, someone's lawnmower in the distance, the particular domestic hum of a place where most people were exactly where they expected to be. I thought about Brody. He'd gone with Jolene to her sister's place the week after the papers were served. I hadn't seen him since. He didn't understand what was happening, and I had no way to explain it to him in terms a 6-year-old could hold. What I could do, and what I'd already discussed with Raymond, was document my willingness to remain involved in his life and put in a letter to Jolene through counsel. Whether she honored, that was her choice. I wasn't going to chase it. What I'd built over 12 years was intact. The shops were running. The house was mine. The man who'd sat in a diner with Gary Strickland weeks ago and listened to his story he recognized was not going to end up living that same story. I recorded voice memo number 6 that night. The Kyle Mercer call, the recording, Raymond's response, Owen's visit. I paused at the end for a moment. Then I said, Jolene thought she'd picked the right target. A man with enough to lose that he'd rather absorb it than fight. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about most things. I stopped the recording. Mediation took place on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the papers were served. Raymond had prepared me for it with the thoroughness of a man who understood that preparation is the only thing that separates a good outcome from a bad one. Jolene and I sat on opposite sides of a conference table in a downtown Knoxville office building, our respective attorneys beside us. She looked composed. She was always composed in public. It was one of the things I'd once admired about her. But there was something different in how she held herself that morning. A guardedness that hadn't been there in the early days of our marriage, when she'd had every reason to believe she was in control of how things would end. She wasn't in control of this. The mediation lasted 4.5 hours. I won't recount every exchange. Most of it was attorneys talking to a mediator, while Jolene and I sat across from each other, saying very little directly. But the shape of it was exactly what Raymond had predicted. Delaney and Cross came in with their list. Raymond laid the prenuptial fidelity clause on the table alongside the photographs, the call logs, and Gary Strickland's signed declaration. Jolene's attorney asked for a recess after 20 minutes. When they came back, the spousal support claim had been withdrawn. What remained was the division of assets acquired during the marriage. A relatively short list, given that we'd been married 2.5 years, and I'd entered with clearly documented separate property. She received her personal belongings, a vehicle we'd purchased jointly 18 months ago, and a settlement figure that Raymond described afterward as fair and far below what she'd have gotten if the fidelity clause hadn't been in play. She signed everything that afternoon. I signed everything that afternoon. Outside the building, Raymond shook my hand and said I'd handle the process as well as any client he'd worked with. I thanked him and meant it. 2 weeks after mediation, Norma Strickland called me, Jolene's mother. I almost didn't answer that one either, but something made me pick up. She was quiet at first, like she was choosing her words the way you do when you know you don't have many to spend. Then she said, I owe you an apology, Marshall. I didn't know about the first time. About Gary. I didn't know she'd done this before. Another pause. I should have asked harder questions a long time ago. I told her I appreciated the call. I meant that too. Norma asked about Brody. I told her he was a good kid who hadn't done anything wrong. She said she knew that. We left it there. The call lasted 8 minutes. It didn't change anything legally or materially. But there was something about a 61-year-old woman calling to say I was wrong that sat differently than most things in this entire process. She didn't have to make that call. She made it anyway. 3 weeks after mediation, I got a text from Dana Mercer. Short. She'd always been economical in her messages. She said Kyle had moved out and that she'd filed her own papers. She said she and her daughter were doing okay. She said thank you one more time. I texted back, take care of yourself and your girl. That was the end of that correspondence. The Farragut shop set a quarterly revenue record the month the divorce finalized. My Bearden location was up 15% year over year. The third shop, which I'd been considering expanding, had a contractor coming in for an assessment in February. I'd built 3 businesses from scratch, and they were still standing, still growing, because no one had gotten their hands on what I'd spent 12 years making. Owen and I had dinner on a Friday night about a month after everything finalized. A proper dinner, steaks, not porch beers, at a place in Bearden we'd been going since our early 30s. We talked about his kids, his wife, a road trip he was planning in the spring. Normal conversation. The kind you get back to when the emergency is over. Near the end of the evening, Owen set down his glass and looked at me for a moment. You doing all right? Really? I thought about it honestly before I answered. Yeah, I said. I am. He nodded like he believed me. Because it was true. I thought about Brody sometimes. I hoped Jolene let him stay close to Owen and me in whatever way she could tolerate. I'd written the letter Raymond had suggested, a formal, documented expression of willingness to remain involved, and it was on record. The rest was up to her. I drove home that night along the same roads I'd driven for 20 years, past the Farragut shop with its lights off and the sign I'd put up when I bought it, past the stretch of Kingston Pike where I'd followed Kyle Mercer without him having any idea, past the neighborhood where I'd built a life that was still mine. I parked in the driveway, went inside, and stood in my kitchen for a moment in the quiet. Then I started thinking about February and the contractor and whether the expansion made more sense on the east side or the north. Some men get knocked down and spend years trying to remember who they were before it happened. I got knocked down, kept my footing, and walked back out into my own life with everything that mattered still in my hands. That's what 12 years of building something teaches you. You don't let go of it easily, and you don't let someone else decide what it's worth.